O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Morning, members. Minister's statement. Minister Acknowledgments, good day, Minister Education, Culture, Employment.
Mr. Speaker, the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre has acted as the Territory's museum for the past 40 years. The institution cares for a large collection of objects representing the peoples, cultures, history, and land of the Northwest Territories on behalf of all people who live here. Yet the Heritage Centre is more than a museum. For 40 years, it has produced exhibitions, housed the N.W.T archives, undertaken archaeological expeditions, and place names research and administration. Also, it provides technical, logistical, and financial support to individuals and organizations involved in cultural activities and the arts. The Heritage Centre works with communities and groups across the Territory to care for, research, and celebrate our rich cultures, history, and languages. The Centre supports community members to tell their own stories, highlighting Northern culture and heritage to more than 60,000 visitors each year with innovative projects that have been celebrated on the national stage. Mr. Speaker, in April, the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre received a Canadian Museums Association Award for Outstanding Achievement in Exhibition for one such project. We took care of them, special constables in the N.W.T. This nationally significant exhibit honors Indigenous Northerners who worked as special constables and as seamstresses, guides, and interpreters. By sharing the skills needed to live and work in the North, local people often made the difference between life and death to the Canadian Mounted Police, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The We Took Care of Them website is the first online museum exhibit to be available in all 11 N.W.T official languages. The Heritage Centre staff also created 6 traveling exhibits that members of the RCMP are circulating to communities across the North. Developing these outreach projects, along with the main museum exhibit, ensures that Northerner stories are made available beyond the walls of the physical building to people across the Territory and around the world. The We Took Care of Them project was developed collaboratively by the governments of the Northwest Territories, the RCMP, and the people of the Northwest Territories who contributed their stories. I'd like to extend my congratulations to everyone involved. Mr. Speaker, while it's heartening to look back and celebrate the achievements of the past 40 years, it is also important to build on these successes, explore new possibilities, and look to the future. I'm proud to say that the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre has developed a national reputation for excellence in exhibits, conservation, archival management, and archaeological research. To continue this work and ensure that our building accommodates current and future programming, the Department of Education, Culture and Employment is undertaking a study of the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre to address building deficiencies and explore a midlife systems retrofit. Mr. Speaker, on June 15th, we will host a birthday party to celebrate 40 years of operation for the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre. This free public event will feature culture and heritage-related activities, including storytelling, talks by museum and community experts, traditional games, and music to highlight and celebrate the work of the Heritage Centre. I encourage everyone to come out to the party, have some fun, and learn more about the activities and the work that occur in the building, serve and represent all the people of the Northwest Territories. Message, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statement. Minister, good day, the Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to advance our government's commitment towards community wellness and safety, we are taking steps to improve the care for our people by working with the Registered Nurses Association of the Northwest Territories and Nunavut to explore the creation of one self-regulatory framework for all nursing professions in the Northwest Territories. Currently, to practice in the Northwest Territories, registered nurses and nurse practitioners apply for licensing to the association, while licensed practical nurses apply for licensing to the Department of Health and Social Services. This dual registration process can be confusing for nurses, including new graduates as well as those relocating to the Northwest Territories. Removing barriers so that nurses can provide invaluable health services and care, and improving the ways that we support our nurses during their work is what is driving our work with the association. Mr. Speaker, nurses are the heart of our healthcare system. They are often the first point of contact for individuals seeking healthcare in our communities, and they provide invaluable service. As highly visible role models, nurses promote healthy living by personally adopting a healthier lifestyle and by encouraging residents to make healthier choices. Today's nurses not only serve at the front line, but publish scientific research, develop mobile medical applications, and are actively engaged in addressing healthcare policy. They are the face of the healthcare for many in the North and collaborate with their colleagues from the social workers and physicians to hospital administrators and public safety personnel to ensure that our residents are taken care of and are receiving quality care. This is why, as part of the National Nursing Week earlier this month, and in recognition of the exceptional services that nurses provide to residents and communities on a daily basis, I signed a Memorandum of Understanding with Mr. Ramel Silviero, President of the Registered Nurses Association of the Northwest Territories and Nunavut. This MOU commits the Department of Health and Social Services and the Association to create one regulatory framework for all nurses. Having one body that regulates the practice of nursing for all registered nurses, nurse practitioners, licensed practical nurses, and registered psychiatric nurses in the Northwest Territories will streamline licensing and ensure that all nurses have greater access to training and resources to perform their scope of practice safely and collaboratively within the health system. Mr. Speaker, to establish a single body that can regulate all nursing professions, we will require adjusting the legislative framework. The project will hopefully be completed during the life of the 19th Legislative Assembly, and as we are nearing the end of the 18th Legislative Assembly, we felt that it was important to start the work now by solidifying our intent to carry out this work in the years to come. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank all of our nursing professionals throughout the Northwest Territories for being the face of healthcare in many of our communities. Working closely with the Registered Nurses Association of the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, our government is committed to finding ways to advance our goal of best health, best care for a better future by improving the care we provide to our residents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to move item 5, recognition of visitors in the gallery, prior to member statements and address it presently. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Requesting unanimous consent to move item 5 to right after Minister's statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, we're joined today by the grade 6 class from Princess Alexandra School. They managed to make their yearly trek up here despite some concerns that they wouldn't make it because the bus that was carrying them was coming out of high level. So I'd like to introduce half of them, and then my colleague from Hay River South will introduce the other half. We have Mr. Jacob Allward, Avia Ashton, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, it was introduced to her, Joshua Barnes, Cameron Bateman, Julianne Grunewagen, Braden Michaud, Ethan Morin, Riley Robillard, Corinne Smith, Shelby Snow, Thomas Smith, Caleb Swan, Diesel Bolio, Bert Buckley, Phoenix Cassaway, Otto Peter, Danica Coquell, Leland Lafferty, Kiana Dryneck, Adrian Drakes Bilodeau, Jesse Brandt, a teacher, and then some chaperones, Mark Harris, Nikki Ashton, Scott Cloutier, and Bertha Smallgeese. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. How tunga sa guyan digi ke hudzai ke good down in the member Hay River South.
Speaker, I too like to recognize the PA school that's here on their trip and their teachers and chaperones. I don't think I'm going to do as good a job as my colleague from Hay River North. Some of these names are a little tough. Charlotte Chocolate, Deanna Coleman, Delaney Cross, Gracious DeVirda, Everett DeRocher, Mia Harris, Louis King, Natalie Leon, Lexus Pelosi, Jack Pietas, Mackenzie Swartz, Ryan Tambor Wilson, Deacon Tybring, Cashton Weiss, Xavier Graham, Braden Gully, Brody Hodgson Bolio, Kansas Lockhart, Ian Cayenne, Brianna Simster, Charlie Smallgeese, Stephanie Haas, teacher, Caitlin Grunwagon, chaperone, Sandy Kroger, chaperone, Tamara Palsy, chaperone, and James Dixon, chaperone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Welcome to our assembly. It's always great to have an audience, especially the young generation. Recognition of visitors in gallery. I mean, good to go again. They have to you can go down in the member Grace Leaf.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome the following people from the Registered Nurses Association of the Northwest Territories in Nunavut who are with us here today. Ramel Silviero, who is the President, Denise Bowen, the Executive Director, Jan Inman, the Director of Professional Conduct Review, and Shauna Tom, the Director of Regulatory Services and Policy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for being here today.
Merci. I'll turn to the Yandigi Hudzami, go down in the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I agree. It is great to see all the youth here today, and so I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of the youth climate strikers that are here today. And in particular, I want to acknowledge some residents from Yellowknife North. Ella Coquel, Makoa Coquel, Jack Kataska, Aurora Nind, Emma Willoughby, and of course, I want to thank them all for reminding us that leaders today must take action to protect their future. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
Merci. I'll turn to the Yandigi Hudza, go down in the member Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have amazing constituents at Range Lake. We have so many adults that give back to our community. But what's more exciting is to see our youth stepping up and using a community lens. So part of our climate change activists that are here today is Ms. Amosa Sivakumar, who I know personally, has been our page. I know our mother. She's a wonderful person, and we're hoping that you'll keep this up right through as you become an adult. So congratulations for all you do, all that you all do for our future.
Merci. I'll turn to the Yandigi Hudza in the Ami, go down in the member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to recognize our gallery of youth and the climate change protesters there. Miss Emily Bayan from the South 2. Thank you.
Merci. I'll turn to the Hudza, you can go down in the member Yellowknife South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to recognize two constituents from Yellowknife South, Jan Inman and Tanisha McMullen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. I'll turn to the Yandigi Hudza, I mean, you can go down in Daudi. Member statement. Member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to talk about climate change, which now, without a doubt, is a climate crisis. I've spoken about this issue before, but today, as wildfires drive people from their homes, I feel a new sense of urgency. Here's why. The Canada Climate Change Report shows our northern climate is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. Further, warming is accelerating and it's effectively irreversible. As people have said, there is no plan to refreeze the Arctic. The cause is carbon dioxide emissions from human activity. We can see the results for ourselves in the Northwest Territories: shorter ice road seasons, thawing permafrost, unpredictable precipitation, and intense wildfires. Mr. Speaker, I see a real disconnect in my own life. I believe the science, but my response doesn't live up to this emergency. Sure, I do easy things like recycling, composting, and riding my bike to work, but my life hasn't fundamentally changed, and it's time. It's time to take meaningful action. Young people are leading the way. They're inspired by Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager who started the climate strikes that are now popular everywhere. They believe that the climate crisis is going to dominate their lives and the lives of their children. They want to commit to change. Some students in Inuvik and Yellowknife have started increasing climate crisis awareness with public events such as the one that's here today, and they want us as adults and leaders on board. Mr. Speaker, this is a huge problem, but there are actions we can take that will make a difference. Government has a role to play by providing leadership and funding. Let's develop a retrofit economy that will create jobs while reducing energy consumption in our homes. Let's continue to make over our power grid so that it's green with additional solar and wind power investments. It's time for an updated version of the 1-ton challenge program of 15 years ago to get people to change behavior that's hurting rather than helping the environment. And while we're at it, government could take a close look at its own consumption patterns. What if there was a whole-of-government approach to the climate crisis, managed by a secretariat, that would look at government's procurement of everything from trucks to roads to assess the impact on greenhouse gas emissions in order to make informed, less harmful choices? Here's the thing. We are already paying the cost of this climate crisis.
Member Yellowknife North, Yellowknife Center, your time for a member statement has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek unanimous consent.
I'll see. Member seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? Statement.
Massey colleagues, Massey Mr. Speaker. Here's the thing, we are already paying the cost of the climate crisis, so why don't we invest in mitigation as well? There is no downside, so what are we waiting for? Massey.
I'll see. Member statement. Member Ike Gooden and the member Mackenzie Delta.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today is World Climate Change Day. It is important to note that this is a very significant day. Mr. Speaker, we all need to do our part in preventing impacts to the Northwest Territories, Canada, and the rest of the world. There's evidence over the past years that our land is drastically changing. This, of course, is due to climate change. The government of the Northwest Territories has taken a strategic approach to developing renewable energy sources. Mr. Speaker, more planning and promoting on our part should be taken seriously. These energy-efficient solutions ensure the strength of greenhouse gas mitigation efforts. Homeowners, businesses, and industry really should take a closer look at wind and solar sources to heat and power our homes and businesses. The effects of climate change that we are witnessing in the Delta include, but are not limited to, permafrost thaw, slumps forming along the rivers, thawing permafrost resulting in damage to highways, drier forests in the N.W.T. resulting in extreme forest fires, changes to biological events such as timing of wildlife migration, hunters and trappers have shorter seasons to gather food for their families, shorter winter roads due to freeze-up occurring later, and ice roads closing earlier in the spring. Mr. Speaker, energy efficiency means direct savings and less of an impact to our environment, and we should really keep that up. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. It won't surprise members of this House, but I've already made 10 statements on climate change and carbon pricing during the 18th Assembly. At some point today, most of us will walk by the students on the climate change strike outside of this building. We owe it to them and the others that will follow us to make our positions very clear and on the record regarding the climate change crisis. I'd like to start with an apology to our youth. We have failed them so far. Although there is a narrow window where we can still save this planet, according to the International Panel on Climate Change. Unfortunately, Cabinet's plan is not going to get the N.W.T where we need to be. It was 1 year ago today that I called out Cabinet's climate change plan and urged the federal government to reject it. I'll repeat that call again here today and hope that the all N.W.T residents will also reject Cabinet's plan. 44% of the greenhouse gas reductions to meet the Pan-Canadian Framework target are to come from huge expansions of the Tolson hydro facilities. There's no money to build the dams or power lines that will cost billions, and no confirmed buyers either north of the lake or into the provinces. Cabinet's energy strategy is masquerading as an infrastructure proposal to the federal government. Tolson expansion will divert time and effort away from building energy self-sufficiency, especially in our smaller communities. Cabinet's carbon tax proposal is unfair, as the largest emitters, the diamond mines, will get all their payments back. Individuals, families, and small businesses will subsidize the required N.W.T contributions to Tolson expansion and the limited investments into renewables. Lastly, the Auditor General's finding on our failed climate change leadership has not been addressed. Cabinet has made no changes to provide the required leadership and authority to take real action on the climate change crisis. I've called for a Climate Change Act, mandatory consideration of climate change implications in all our spending, and infrastructure submissions that prioritize projects that show the greatest greenhouse gas reductions in our communities over mega projects, especially investments in improved energy efficiency in our housing. The residents of the N.W.T deserve much better on the issue of climate change crisis, reductions to our cost of living through energy self-reliance while building a greener economy. We need new leadership, vision, and action, and our youth today are showing us the way. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I spoke about the need to support and pay attention to our youth. Today, they are just outside and right here in our gallery telling us themselves, we need to listen. Mr. Speaker, this is the second climate strike organized by Yellowknife students in the past few weeks. They're joining thousands of young people across the country and around the world who are rising up to challenge the status quo. They're challenging the world's leadership to take serious steps and make fundamental changes. Here are some of the messages they need us to hear and understand, Mr. Speaker. Our actions on climate change will define the lives of the younger generation. Confronting climate change requires new thinking, vision, and leadership. We should create a center of climate change and innovation to bring everyone under one roof that include youth, elders, scientists, engineers, traditional harvesters, industry, and governments. We must reduce greenhouse gas emissions urgently. Government and industry must incorporate environmental cost accounting to assess true cost and find efficiencies. And climate change, adaptations, and innovations must be taught in schools. Mr. Speaker, the reality of climate change might be an inconvenience for many of us, but for our youth, it's nothing less than a dire threat to their future. I'm glad to say that important steps are being taken. We have signed on to the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. We have adopted the 2030 Energy Strategy and Action Plan. We have developed a climate change strategic framework, and there's a forthcoming action plan. That framework commits us to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30% over 2005 levels by 2030. We have initiated solar projects in Colville Lake and Fort Simpson. We have wind turbines being set up in Inuvik, and Diavik Mine has relied on wind energy for many years now. I'm glad to see other initiatives like small community microgrids and proposals for testing renewable diesel being talked about. These are steps in the right direction, but the young people outside and in our chamber today remind us that we must continue moving in this direction. Thank you to the youth for taking your stance, for raising your voice, and for challenging us to be the leaders on climate change that you deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godani, the member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, agriculture and industry has been around for many decades since the early days of the Norman Wells oil field discovery. Mr. Speaker, Tommy the Ox assisted the first explorers in this discovery. Mr. Speaker, agriculture still remains a presence in the community today. My committee colleagues witnessed this during the committee consultation meetings by visiting the Satu Gardens on May the 8th, a private enterprise with some farm animals and crops of choice. A similar example, a resident harvests 25,000 to 30,000 pounds of potatoes annually. Mr. Speaker, the agricultural strategy provides unique opportunities for home food, nutrition, and security. Our community residents are resilient, and what better way in taking advantage of the strategy and of our 24-hour daylight. The N.W.T. agricultural strategy provides an outline of guidance to assist our residents on supports and resources. It should be noted, Mr. Speaker, the window to our summer grow season is limited. In order for this strategic approach to bear fruit, in addition, the Department of ITI must ensure our regional staff are sharing the same priorities as our residents. Mr. Speaker, history is continuing to repeat itself from the early days to the very same soil that attracted the earlier explorers. Through the advanced techniques, the agricultural strategy can assist with homegrown opportunities while creating experiences for our youth in the process. Must be, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godani, the member Tuna de Wolade.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to talk about an issue that has garnered increased national attention over the past few years, that being the sterilization without proper prior consent. Unfortunately, the concept of either forced or coerced sterilization of women is not a new phenomenon for Canada, nor is it solely a part of our history. In fact, there's mounting evidence across our country that proves just how far this practice has reached and in some cases continues to reach. Mr. Speaker, let's consider the history of coerced sterilization in Canada. In 2 provinces, this practice was lawful, as it was enshrined in law for Alberta and British Columbia between 1930 and 1970. A parliamentary inquiry from the mid-70s, public documents reveal that the federal government was also facilitating a soft program of sterilization across the N.W.T. and Nunavut through the 1960s and 70s. In that time, a number of women who were sterilized without full knowledge or consent was in the thousands. And that's not even counting the number of women who may have been sterilized without even knowing it. And let alone the number of undocumented sterilizations that occurred off the record books. Mr. Speaker, while it may sound like a practice of coerced sterilization is firmly behind us, it still persists today, as evidenced by 2 class action lawsuits currently being litigated in Alberta and Saskatchewan for hundreds of millions of dollars. Between the 2 cases, there are hundreds of Indigenous women who have alleged coerced sterilization over the years, with some alleging as recently as December 2018 to have occurred. Additionally, prosecutors involved in these cases have noted numerous other records of coerced sterilization in Ontario, Manitoba, Quebec, Yukon, and the N.W.T. In fact, the same issue was brought up in this House in 1998 by a former member who talked about an N.W.T woman who had undergone sterilization unbeknownst to her after delivering a child at the Charles Camsell Hospital in Alberta. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Merci. Member statements like in that Sadzasu then heck had you the Amik anyone. What the yik anyone member Tuna de Wallade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've got some anecdotal evidence to share on this matter. Last month, I spoke to a woman who discovered that her daughter, a young, university-educated Indigenous woman, was asked by a doctor if she was interested in sterilization. Her situation, such an inquiry was unprompted and highly unnecessary. I urge all citizens to be vigilant. If you suspect that you or someone you know has been pressured for sterilization, make it be known. No person should have the procedure performed on them without free, prior, informed consent. Anything else would be a violation of the victim's human rights. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on March 15th, 2019, a fire broke out on the 11th floor of the Mackenzie Place high-rise. Luckily, everybody made it out safe, and the Hay River Fire Department quickly extinguished the fire. Unfortunately, the resulting water damage and loss of power meant that the building was deemed not safe for habitation. And just like that, 123 residents were left without a home, and in most cases, with nothing more than the clothes they were wearing. Before I go any further, I have to commend the efforts of everyone in Hay River and KFN who sprang into action and helped the evacuees by providing accommodations, meals, toiletries, and so much more. Our community always steps up in times of need, and this was no exception. However, despite everyone's best efforts, the effects of the fire are still being felt. Many evacuees were able to find rental accommodations in the private market, and the Housing Corporation managed to provide housing to many more. Unfortunately, according to the most recent statistics I've seen, a number of evacuees are still facing serious housing issues. 18 people are considered to have unstable housing, meaning they're couch surfing, camping, sleeping in cars, and so on. Essentially, these people are homeless. Another 28 have temporary housing, which means they could become homeless. The fact that we're more than 2 months on from the fire and are still facing these issues exposes deficiencies in both the availability of rental units in Hay River and in how the N.W.T deals with those in need of social housing. Some of the evacuees facing housing issues might only be in that situation because rental units are sparse and the cost of rent is high, and in a better market, they could find a place on their own. However, a third of the high-rise tenants had their rent paid by income assistance, making the high-rise the largest concentration of social housing in Hay River. Many of these individuals are considered hard to house. Some of them are banned from renting from the Housing Corporation because of arrears, and they have difficulty finding private accommodations because they burned bridges with other landlords. Mr. Speaker, to address this situation, we need a plan. We need a plan from the Housing Corporation. We need a plan from the Minister of Education regarding income assistance, and I haven't seen anything yet. I brought this issue up time and time again in this House. The last time I brought this up was 10 days before this event occurred. For years, the MLAs from Hay River have been trying to get the government to create a plan to deal with the situation, and now it's happened and I still don't see a plan. So I'll have questions for the Minister of Housing, and if I have time, I'll have questions for the Minister of ECE, I'll have questions for the Minister of Justice, and for the Minister of Health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today all around the world, students have gone on strike. And what would be so important to our next generation of their classes for day to exercise their freedoms of speech and assembly? The answer is climate change, Mr. Speaker. Many members have spoken about that today, and I think it's important that, that this is an issue that is not falling on deaf ears. When our citizens speak out, be they students, be they regular-aged adults, be they seniors, we will always listen and bring their message to the floor of this assembly. If it is important enough to the future of to future generations and to the future of our territory. Why are our youth striking? When they're expected to attend school? Sadly, to so many young people, the consequences of climate change appear to be left unaddressed, or at best getting lip service from governments across the country and around the world. The advice of experts is being ignored and oftentimes challenged by ideological opinions and personal views, or the contingencies of everyday life and the cost of living, rather than the real issue, which is the future of our planet. This has left many students feeling that there will be no future for them either. This is the second student strike this year. The last one occurred on March 15th and saw roughly 1.6 million students striking across the globe. Outside of this House, one northern student has organized a strike. Her name is YELLOWKNIFE, and she says she's protesting because, quote, "we believe that climate change should be taken more seriously and that the North needs to show leadership in tackling climate change by ensuring we create an innovative and resilient society for a future." Mr. Speaker, I hope all members of this House will join me in passing along our encouragement to these students for their climate change activism and take a few moments today to walk outside of the legislature to speak to them and hear out these motivated and driven young activists. Intergenerational equity and ensuring our lands and resources benefit future generations is a key concern for not only those students but for all Northerners and must be at the heart of government decision-making. Numerous statements have been made, numerous recommendations by standing committees all around this topic, and yet we still find the government's plans and proposals lacking. We need to do more. It's not that nothing has been done, it's that not enough has been done, because this is not an issue that can be ignored. This is a crisis that potentially will jeopardize the future of life on this planet, and we must take action today for all days to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and the member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a couple of weeks ago we had youth parliaments here at the Legislative Assembly, and my daughter Marie Carpenter was the member for N.W.T. And out of all the topics to discuss, she talked about the cost of living in the North. And Mr. Speaker, I will read her statement today. Mr. Speaker, the cost of living in N.W.T. is the highest in Northwest Territories. Increased fuel prices have affected the cost of food, whether from a grocery store or traditional food harvested on the land. Mr. Speaker, the rising cost has been hard on hunters living in N.W.T. Harvesting food from the land, lakes, and ocean is essential to our invalid way of life and well-being of our communities. When families cannot hunt, they have to purchase all food from the store. Families simply cannot afford the price increases of fuel, food, supplies, and equipment. According to the Bureau of Statistics, the average personal income in N.W.T. communities isn't much more than $35,000 a year, compared to the $60,000 average for the Northwest Territories. It is very difficult, if not impossible, for many of my constituents to afford basic food from the grocery stores with such high cost. Mr. Speaker, data published by Proof on Food Insecurity Policy Research showed that 17.6% of households in Northwest Territories are food insecure, and over 30% of the territory's children live in food insecure homes. Recent studies and news articles across the North have shown that we cannot rely on the federal government's program Nutrition North to fix food security issues. We can see the proof of this data each time we go to homes, schools, and health centers in N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, focusing on improving these statistics will benefit the mental and physical well-being of families, especially children in N.W.T. It will overall reduce our government spending in areas such as education, health, education, and social services. The mandate of this government called for action to reduce the cost of living and poverty, not to increase it. The mandate also called upon the government to promote the consumption of traditional foods such as fish and wildlife to improve nutrition and improve the wellness of the way of Indigenous peoples in the territory. Mr. Speaker, food security needs to be the focus of our government now and into the future. As leaders, we must align our policies with other levels of governments to ensure that our families, elders, children, and youth can be strong and sustain an invalid way of life by having healthy food options harvested from our land in N.W.T. communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Tim Brown came into this world August 5th, 1966, and left on May 5th, 2019. Tim possessed wisdom far beyond most people, a rare way with words and the ability to explain things that never came across as condescending, but rather as enlightening. During or after in conversation with Tim, you may not always have felt smarter or necessarily agreed, would, however, most often than not, feel better about whatever it was that you were talking about. If you were brave enough to debate with him, rest assured you would know where he stood on subjects in no certain terms by the end of the conversations. Over the years of people knowing Tim, through their most difficult times and struggles through life, Tim was always there for them, offering an ear to listen, advice and encouragement when needed, or a kick in the butt, or a hard truth if that was what was required. To borrow a phrase Tim would often say, the reality is, Tim was by no means perfect. He would say so himself. Some people might say he was at times not nice, and they'd be correct. Other might say he was an amazing, kind person. They too would be correct. The reason for this is quite simple. Tim did not treat people poorly, he treated them accordingly, meaning he treated people how they treated him. If you were nice, he was nice in return. Tim was a great storyteller, and as such, people enjoyed Tim's time, especially when it was about his fishing or his family. To Tim's family, especially Melinda, Finn, Coleman, and Rebecca, I will tell you this. Tim will be the first to admit he's not perfect. What you may not know is that in conversations with Tim, he would say that he may not have been perfect, but he would look at his wife and children, and he knew that he'd got something in his life perfectly right. To borrow another phrase Tim would often say, make no mistake about it, Tim loved his family and his wife and children. Tim was survived by his wife, Melinda, his children, Rebecca, Finn, Coleman, great children, Devin, Swallow, and Sabi Nessel, and numerous nephews, nieces, and friends. Mr. Speaker, it was fitting to see the local airline and helicopter companies do one last flyby at the airport as Tim's body was being flown to Yellowknife to be cremated after his services. This was a very classy action and greatly appreciated by his family and friends. The Brown family would like to thank everybody for their support and prayers during their time of sorrow. Mr. Speaker, Tim was sadly missed and will never be forgotten.
Our condolences to the family and also to the community as well. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of E&R responsible for the climate file. In my statement earlier today, I outlined some of the important points being raised by students bringing their climate action to the legislature today. So I'd like to ask the Minister, does the government accept the need for some sort of environmental cost planning and accounting process so that the full cost of any program or project takes into account its environmental impacts and the need for any mitigation? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we appreciate the fact that the students are here voicing their concern with climate change, and something that we in the North have faced a long time before the rest of the country, before it became flavor of the day. We were feeling the effects of climate change, particularly in the Mackenzie Delta where I'm from, and the fact that we see banks falling into the river, and I'd hate to come to a point someday where we walk across the river because there's so much sediment in the water. But and I appreciate the work they're doing. They're obviously very passionate about it, and it's something that I would like to see them continue. Being the grandfather of six, I have a personal interest in this because I do want to see the day where my grandchildren don't have to worry about the effects of climate change. And this is something that as a government that we are making attempts to deal with. Like I said, the North felt the effects of climate change long before it was flavor of the day. And now to the rest of the country and the rest of the world, welcome to the file. Mr. Speaker, as we feel the effects of climate change in our planning to do infrastructure, we've seen what it could do to some of the infrastructure that's already there with the ground sliding into the river and some of the effect it's having on some of the local infrastructure. We've seen that. So as we go forward, we we'll take into consideration all that as we plan projects, and I think it's already happening. As I said, we felt the effects of climate change long before the rest of the country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Akil, the Cassie member, Hay River North. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that reply and his acknowledgement on the effects that climate change is having on the North, and that it is more dire than most other regions. And that for sure in planning our infrastructure that we currently own and going forward, that we have to take into account the fiscal and financial accounting aspects in order to overcome those. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to ask the Minister, what steps is the government taking to make sure that our young people are equipped to make contributions on climate action by introducing climate change impacts, adaptation, mitigation, and innovation to the N.W.T. education system? Is the Minister working with the Minister of Education to develop curriculum on climate change? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, recognizing the importance of the voices of the youth in the Northwest Territories. And I remember, I believe it was in the last Assembly, the Assembly before, we actually had a youth forum that the Premier of the day had implemented, and we got a feedback from a lot of youth across North Territory. I think there's some merit in the member's suggestion. It's something we could talk with the young people in the Northwest Territories about, is potentially having, working with education, some type of a climate change symposium where we could get their opinion on what they would like to see taught in schools. And I mean, it is a serious issue, Mr. Speaker, and it's one that the more we educate our youth as they're coming through the educational system, I think the greater effect it'll have on the future of the Northwest Territories and our ability to deal with climate change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, oral question, Tada the Cassie member, Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Minister's response, and he did indicate the idea potentially of a symposium. And so, you know, clearly our young people have the most at stake, and maybe what I'll ask the Minister is if he will in fact commit the government, or maybe at least will the government consider establishing an ongoing forum or symposium that can have regular constructive dialogue and that would seek advice from the N.W.T's youth on climate change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we recognize that there are a number of other governments and organizations that in the N.W.T. with climate change roles. It would be difficult for me at this stage of this Assembly to commit the government to a symposium, and I think through the Transitional Committee and providing some advice to the incoming 19th, and I think we'll hear it during the election period that's coming up in from October, the election on October 1st. So I think we'll hear a lot of concerns with climate change, and I'm sure potential candidates that are running will be telling the constituents that their plans on how to deal with this ongoing issue. And let's make sure that it's a plan that they're passionate about, not one that they're just saying to get the public's vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Nundere Cassie member, Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I agree with the Minister. We absolutely have to, encourage our forthcoming leaders that we have to, actively engage our youth in getting to the table and having the conversation. But I also don't like the idea that we're pushing these sorts of things off. There's never a time where we can't keep the discussion going about climate change. And so I would also like to ask the Minister, has the government considered convening call it a climate action group that would include youth, elders, scientists, even economists, traditional harvesters, etc., industry even, to discuss and seek innovative ways to achieve responsible development and a sustainable society? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through a number of the initiatives and strategies that we come forward with, we go out and seek public opinion, consultation with affected stakeholders, and I think it's through that process that they're able to get their input. We have 3 months left in this assembly again. I mean, I can commit to this chamber that we'll explore the idea of doing something such as that and work with stakeholders. And again, we can make the suggestions, and as we've seen at the beginning of the 18th, it'll be upon the members of the 19th to determine at that time whether it's something that they want to implement. And I believe it is. I believe it's a serious enough issue. And again, I've said it 2 or 3 times now. We've felt the effects long before everybody else, so we've taken steps to mitigate some of the effects it has. So there's a lot of merit in the members' suggestions, and we've heard, and I'm sure everybody else has heard, the young people have heard. So it's a commitment that I think this government, not this government, this assembly has, and this building, this institution has to follow up on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. The member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I had a member statement about Tim Brown. Just previously, before he passed away, I was at the airport and we talked about a situation that happened where a piece of equipment ended up falling through the permafrost in Fort Simpson, of all places. So we were talking about it. Wasn't the operator. He did this job 20 years. Wasn't the equipment. So what changed? The environment. So I have some questions for the Minister of Infrastructure today, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I'd like to thank Tim for bringing this forward. Can the Minister advise the House what has the Department done to prepare for climate change, especially with the issue on the southern part of N.W.T? I've known we've done some good stuff in the north, and I've seen the work, research done there, but what about the southern part, and especially when it comes to airports and highways in the southern part of Northwest Ontario? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
For attending today. I'm going to take this opportunity to actually speak to a number of initiatives that the Government of Northwest Territories is doing, because as some members in this House say they don't think we're doing enough, but I want these young people to hear exactly what we're doing as the Government of Northwest Territories, because I believe the actions that we are taking go beyond well of small jurisdictions like we are. We're punching above our weight, so I'm going to read every word on these questions. So he wants to know what we're doing on the southern part for climate change around airports and highways. The Northwest Territories infrastructure network is vulnerable to the effects of climate change due to our reliance on ice roads and infrastructure built on permafrost. Changes in climate, including temperature, precipitation, or water levels, result in increased variability and could affect the reliability of our system. We rely on the stability of permafrost to maintain our highway and runway surfaces and need sufficient water levels to operate the ferry and barge resupply. To address and mitigate the future risks and changes, the Department developed a comprehensive climate change adaptation plan, which covers all aspects of transportation system. The Department has been actively implementing the climate change adaptation plan for over 5 years now. We have invested in research and development, including installing and monitoring test sections all across the system. We are working with world-class research institutes such as the University of Calgary, Carleton University, McGill, Laurier, and the National Research Council of Canada to undertake research development on the modeling of the future and developing mitigation and adaptation measures for our assets. We have completed climate change vulnerability assets across the system. We've been improving porous surface and drainage conditions on our highways and runways. We are working to realign winter roads to overland alignments, and we've been building permanent bridges at former ice crossings to stabilize the highway system. We have also worked with other government departments on the overall Northwest Territories Climate Change Strategic Framework. We are leading the national level task force for northern infrastructure, along with our counterpart territories and provinces, to ensure our infrastructure design, construction, maintenance practices are climate change resilient. We have developed best practices in buildings for northern infrastructure, building in permafrost regions, building in winter and ice roads, and we have recently been audited by the Auditor General on our plans and did receive positive feedback from their review of our work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, nakita de kasi member na hindi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think the minister kind of answered my next question, but I'm going to actually ask it anyway. What mitigation adaptation has the department done to address the issues about low water level, specifically in the riding in the Henday? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I foresee some written questions are coming soon enough. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're tracking the water levels carefully and monitoring changes. We have been in contact with the federal government about dredging to maintain navigational channels, which I talked about yesterday. For our ice and ferry crossings, we have already converted some permanent bridges, and over the long term, we'll continue to work toward converting them to permanent crossings. In the meantime, we have looked at alternative landing and crossing routes which may extend or stabilize the seasons. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tado de kasi member na hindi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can the minister advise us, has the department developed policies and procedures for staff and contractors of following and dealing with climate change issues? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Understanding climate and adjusting accordingly is inherent in all our operations of the transportation system. Climate change has been incorporated into our best practice documents and construction procedures and specifications. We keep involved at the national level to influence and incorporate research into updated national standards and promote professional development. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, no dere kasi member na hindi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the minister for his answers as we move forward on this issue here. Mr. Speaker, has the department developed training programs for staff to help them to identify potential issues when it comes to climate change? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All engineers and technicians within the department have a professional obligation to keep track of the latest developments in their fields of expertise. We sponsor regular training and host a major conference to address current issues, including climate change. We also send our experts to conferences and working groups with their counterparts to review climate change issues at the national and regional levels, and we do undertake risk analysis on all our major projects to ensure climate change resilience is addressed and also incorporated into climate consideration into all our operational activities. So as you can see, Mr. Speaker, we've done a lot of work around climate change and will continue to do so in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Kenny, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I just want to set this up. Cabinet's climate change plan or approach is really made up of the energy strategy, the climate change strategic framework, and the carbon tax. So my questions are to the Premier, as Minister of the Executive and Intergovernmental Affairs. So I'd like to know, how can the N.W.T possibly achieve the pan-Canadian greenhouse gas reduction targets when 44% of those reductions are to come from the mega project Tulsan expansion, when there's no money to build it, no confirmed buyers, either north of the lake or into the provinces? How can we achieve that target, Mr. Speaker? Merci.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Tulsan project is important for many reasons, and as the member knows, we receive considerable support from the federal government to help with the development of this project and the overall business case. And as we told the Prime Minister, we want to be part of the overall solution in dealing with climate change. And I think the federal government recognizes, as does our government, of the potential of the project as part of the overall climate change efforts. The reality is that remote mines make up 50% of our emissions profile and need to be part of the solution now and in the future. Tulsan is best positioned to reduce industrial emissions and stabilize the cost of energy north and south of Grave Slave Lake. If the project proceeds, we can certainly achieve our greenhouse gas emission targets and provide clean energy to resource development for the next 50 years. This is a major project, however, and we are in early stages. The Minister of Infrastructure is leading the development of the business case, and several discussions have already taken place with the Canada Infrastructure Bank. I think it's fair to say they have considerable interest. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, la Canada, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Premier for raising the diamond mines, which is really my next question. So, Cabinet's carbon tax proposal released in July 2018 is really unfair, as the largest emitters, the diamond mines, will get everything back. Individuals, families, and small businesses will subsidize the required N.W.T contributions to Tulsan expansion and the limited investments into renewables. So can the Premier tell us why the diamond mines will get all of the carbon tax they pay back as rebates and grants from individualized accounts? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to correct the member, as what he stated isn't quite accurate, as the approach announced in July 2018 only applied to non-motive fuel, not the carbon tax the large emitters would pay on motive fuels. I wouldn't want the public to be under the impression that the large emitters wouldn't be paying carbon tax. However, as the member would be aware, the approach to carbon tax we developed needs to be consistent with the federal backstop. The federal backstop has an approach to large emitters that charges the carbon price on their output. I think we would want to make sure our approach aligns generally with the approach Canada has taken, but reflects our northern realities. We have always said we want to mitigate the impact of the carbon tax on the cost of living. That is why we are exempting aviation fuel, rebating the carbon tax on heating fuel, and introducing the cost of living offset benefit when we implement the carbon tax. Our Made in the Northwest Territories approach will help mitigate the impacts of the carbon tax on residents, on small business, and on those larger industries that are classified as large emitters. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadadeh, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Premier for that announcement of changes to the carbon tax proposal being on the floor of the House. But the Auditor General's finding on our failed climate change leadership has not really been addressed. Cabinet has made no changes to provide the required leadership and authority to take real action on the climate change crisis. Can the Premier tell us why Cabinet has rejected the calls for a Climate Change Act, mandatory consideration of climate change implications in all our spending, and infrastructure submissions that prioritize projects that show the greatest GHG reductions as part of the efforts to deal with the climate change crisis? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government went through a very long consultative process, and we did and responded to what we heard. So through a review of climate change programs in Canadian jurisdictions, it was evident that the most important factors in the success of these programs were leadership and the authority to act. Addressing climate change is a priority of this government. We have developed both a climate change strategic framework and action plan, which is linked to our work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the energy plan. Further, we have organized ourselves so that climate change is considered in all programs and at all levels of authority. Director level, ADM, Deputy Minister, and ministerial committees have been established. This leadership structure will focus government efforts as we move into the implementation phase of these strategies and plans. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that response, the Premier for that response. I don't think committees are going to cut it. There's been one new committee established, the Standing Committee that reviewed the Climate Change Strategic Framework, asked for a Climate Change Act, some real action. That's not what we've got. But while we've got the students here in the gallery, we need some new leadership, vision, and action to deal with the climate change crisis. So what would the Premier like to say to our youth to instill hope and confidence that the N.W.T is doing its part to meet the climate change crisis? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Addressing climate change is a priority of the 18th Legislative Assembly. Within the life of this government, we have developed both a climate change strategic framework and action plan, which is linked to our work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the energy plan. The government of the Northwest Territories is now poised to take real action over the next 5 years and make progress on our transition to a lower carbon economy, improving our knowledge of climate change impacts, and building resilience and adapting to climate change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Cannon, the member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are also on the climate, and they are addressed to the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources. Given the recent scientific studies about the rate of change, the accelerated change in the climate, it is now being referred to as a crisis. Does the Minister consider the current state of affairs with the warming of the planet a crisis? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I stated before, we've seen the effects of climate change, especially up in the Bodell, long before the rest of the country, and I do believe that we're getting to a point to where it is becoming a crisis. We see that, and I said before that in the Delta we see ground falling into the water, and you look up and around in the Beaufort and Tuck and the erosion on the shore there. I mean, that demonstrates the effect that climate change is having on the north, and we recognize that. So the short answer is to the member's question, yes, I do believe that this is serious enough to be considered a crisis. Thank you, Mr.
Merci. Oral question, Akita Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that response. During the consultation on the 2030 N.W.T climate change strategic framework, some people suggested that the N.W.T create a climate change secretariat, such as exists in both Yukon and Nunavut, to oversee all climate crisis related work, rather than compartmentalizing responsibilities in one department. Why did government decide to not take this advice? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through a jurisdictional review of the climate change programs in Canadian jurisdictions, ENR found that regardless of the organizational structure, the most important factors in their success were leadership and the authority to act. The N.W.T, we believe, have accordingly taken a leadership role on climate change in the territories and organized itself so that climate change is considered at all levels of authority. The director level, I think Premier's stated before, the director level, the ADM, DM, and ministerial committees have been established. And the leadership structure will focus government efforts to implement and report on the climate change strategic framework and to assist with the development and implementation of the 2019-2023 action plan. We also recognize the importance of working with our partners as we move to the implementation phase of the climate change strategic framework. To this end, ENR, we're actually exploring opportunities, approaches to coordinate and guide this work, such as through the establishment of a climate change advisory body. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the answer. I guess I would prefer to see a somewhat independent office looking out for climate change rather than having the government do this directly. I feel that the results may be more credible, but it is what it is, I guess, at this point. I mentioned in my statement about taking a whole-of-government approach to procurement, screening it for how it is mitigating or making worse the issue of climate crisis. And I'm wondering if the government is prepared to institute a whole-of-government procurement policy that takes this full cost accounting into account. Thank you.
Massey. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's a very timely question. The N.W.T recognizes the importance that our government can play on influencing the market for the goods services that we procure. Following broad engagement conducted in 2017 and 18, ENR worked closely with the communities on the development of an N.W.T waste resource management strategy. The strategy is anticipated to be released in the coming month. As part of this strategy, goal number 4 focused on actions to greening government. Greening government means making decisions about what we buy, how we manage our assets, how we run our business to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, energy, water, and solid waste. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it sounds like this waste strategy may go some of the way toward answering this question. My final question is whether the government has any interest in reviving a program such as the 1 Ton Challenge that focuses on personal action and accountability. Does government have any interest in drawing citizens individually into this beyond taxing them with the carbon tax? Thank you.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, we know the crisis that we're in with climate change, and I think the public is becoming more and more educated as we become more and more educated. Our youth are taking steps to become more and more educated, and I think through that process, I think there'll be a lot of people doing that on their own, is reducing their carbon footprint and how they do business, and so. If it's an initiative that could help us address the situation that we're in, then I think it's incumbent on this Assembly. And when I don't say this government, when I talk about the government, I'm talking all 19 members. It's something that this Assembly can look at and possibly get behind and promote and see if we can make that initiative come to be. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, the member, Tuna de Willady.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my member statement, I spoke of a former member of the House talking about coerced sterilization at N.W.T. Following that statement, there was an article written in Wind Speaker publication which described a GNWT program where coerced sterilization victims could come forward to begin an inquiry if they believe they were wrongfully sterilized. My question for the minister is twofold. How long did the program run in that time, and in that time, how many women came forward? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a government, we acknowledge that the abhorrent practice of performing sterilization procedures upon Indigenous women under a forced or coerced circumstance took place in the Northwest Territories in the past, long before any of us were in this House. I personally condemn the practice, as I know all members in this House must, of coerced or forced sterilization. And as a government, we take seriously the accounts that have been shared by residents. And I would really like to commend the individuals for their courage in sharing their stories and bringing forth this issue. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, at this time, I don't have the precise information on the number of women who came forward under that GNWT program that was offered in 1998. It was a number of years ago. However, I would like to reconfirm that this government will always take seriously and respond to patients' accounts of forced sterilization. With respect to the information from the 1998 program, I will do my best to get that information and share it with the member. as well as other members of this House. And I would like to acknowledge once again that I agree with the member that such practices are a violation of medical ethics and of a patient's rights to information and informed consent. So I thank the member for raising the question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question member Tunade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for that response. Mr. Speaker, in December 2018, the Federal Health Minister responded to an issue of coerced sterilization by inviting all provincial and territorial health ministers to participate in a task force on cultural competency in healthcare. My question is, what was the department's response, our department's response to the call, and are we participating? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the federal government has formed a working group to look at ways of embedding cultural safety and humility into the design and delivery of healthcare services in Canada. This working group, as a note, will not deal directly with forced sterilization as part of its mandate. We do support the federal government's efforts to we support their efforts to collaborate with provinces, territories, Indigenous groups, and national provider organizations on measures to improve cultural safety in health system. Mr. Speaker, we are participating in that working group. The N.W.T is also committed to working with Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories in our efforts to improve cultural safety here in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, as the member knows, we have come forward with a cultural safety action plan to help us address the issues, the very real issues around cultural safety that do exist here in the Northwest Territories, and we're determined to do our work in a culturally respectful, fair, and equitable way for all residents. Mr. Speaker, we will ensure that any commitments made through the participation in the FTP working group align with our existing work here in the Northwest Territories in this area. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question member Tunade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do acknowledge and recognize the good work done by this department, our Department of Health and Social Services, on cultural competency. I'd like to ask the Minister about the task force, the federal task force, and just a question of asking the Minister if there is a current status since the task force was formed, or if not, then would the Minister provide a current status to the House once that status is available? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that the FPT working group is intended to be a forward-looking body that will examine ways of embedding cultural safety and humility into the design and delivery of healthcare services throughout the country. They intend to share information about initiatives and promising practice underway across the country, which is one of the reasons we're sharing the work that we've done. And it's also intended to identify opportunities for collaboration between provinces, territories, and other bodies. To date, Mr. Speaker, a draft terms of reference has been developed by the working group, including identifying some guiding principles. This, once again, is a federal document, a federal initiative. As a first step, jurisdictions will be reaching out to their Indigenous partners to see if the Indigenous governments are interested in participating in the working group, and that engagement will hopefully be done soon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, member Tunade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for that response. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister advise us if this is if it's very clear to the practitioners that forced sterilization is not something that can and should be done in the N.W.T. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, today, compared to when this activity was occurring, we have best practices and additional checks and balances in place to ensure that patients are given alternative options before referring a patient to sterilization procedures as part of pre-op today. It's also our best practice that patients are again asked if they fully understand the nature and the consequences of the procedures that they may be wishing to undertake, as part of ensuring that the patient has provided informed and knowledgeable consent before as the procedure is actually done. Mr. Speaker, additional supports can and could be offered, such as counseling, given that this procedure is permanent and irreversible in all situations. So yes, Mr. Speaker, our practitioners know, our practitioners understand the realities, and our procedures have changed radically since 1998 when that study was done by the N.W.T. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Ikeda County, the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I guess I'm not going to get to ask the 4 separate ministers all my questions. Questions and answers are going a little long today, so I'll keep this brief. I'd like to ask the Minister of the Housing, Minister responsible for the Housing Corporation, what has been done to date to address the housing issues of the evacuees of the Hay River high-rise? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in response to the fire, the N.W.T. Housing Corporation has developed a multi-stage plan to support residents that were impacted. And that's done right across all departments. We knew it was something that needed to be addressed, and right away all departments work together to see how we can make an impact. On that note, I want to commend the member in recognizing that the community did step up and that the fire department was on site right away, and that nobody was harmed in any way as well, and they were all out safety. Our latest update, the N.W.T. Housing Corporation has housed 7 individuals in an apartment complex. We've also housed 4 families in 3-bedroom houses temporarily leased from the federal government, and we have also renovated 6 units at the KFN, which are ready for occupation, and are in the process of renovating 10 or more, which will be ready for occupation soon. And Mr. Speaker, just further to that, we will continue to update both the Hay River MLAs on what we are doing as the N.W.T. Housing Corporation and what we are doing as a government, working together collaboratively to adjust the situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Akida, Cassie member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the update. That's basically the same update that I received back in April at the community meeting. So there's still these 18 people who are homeless, essentially, with unstable housing, and there's 26 who are temporarily housed. Those could be the ones in the leased units from the federal government. So going forward, what's the plan? The minister stated there was a plan. Could you please elaborate on that and tell us what he's going to do to make sure these people have stable housing? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before the fire at the high-rise, we did meet with private industry. We've met with the town of Hay River to look at addressing some of the issues that are coming out of the community. As the member knows, the available and suitable land is at a premium in Hay River, and we are trying to work with the municipality to address that, and we're going to continue to work with them in terms of developing a plan. We know that there's a lot of things that are coming down the pipes in terms of economic-wise. It was very unfortunate that the high-rise situation happened, and we'll continue to work with our stakeholders to look at addressing the housing needs in Hay River. And we, as I mentioned, we'll keep the Hay River MLAs up to date. We'll continue to speak with our stakeholders, industry, as well as leadership in Hay River. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Cassie member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I stated, 18 people are homeless. I know for a fact one of those is an infant. There could be other children as well. I can't go back to Hay River and tell them that there's been talks. I need to tell them that there's a plan to put them in a home and give them somewhere safe. So what can the minister tell me is happening to put these people in actual homes? I need a plan. When is it going to be placed on the ground that they can go and live? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A couple of things. Through the N.W.T. Housing Corporation, we didn't have any housing clients in the high-rise. That's where we're doing the collaborative approach, working with all the departments to address the issue. At the same time, we are working with private industry. We're trying to work with the municipality of Hay River. As you've heard in this House before, we do have the co-investment fund that we were able to carve out and put applications in, and that's some of the long-term solutions that we're looking at. And as I mentioned, and it's not only the high-rise that is affected. We also had that senior planning study that I've mentioned in this House before, that we are looking at a couple of municipalities, and Hay River is one of them that we need to address, and we'll continue to work to find a short-term and a long-term solution. And I think in the short term, we have addressed some of the issues, some of the families, not all of them, but we do have to work together to find solutions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. No data Cassie member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the minister said there was no housing clients in the high-rise. Income assistance was paying the rent for about a third, I believe, of the residents of the high-rise, which means that those people, for the most part, were on the housing wait list. So it's not like housing doesn't have clients in there. They have people waiting to get into housing. So this is an issue. So what can I tell them is going to happen in the very near term? What is the plan to house them in the very near term? I know there's these long-term solutions. I know all about the rental issues in Hay River. What is the plan to get them in a house immediately? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, we do know that there is a concern, not a concern, but the available and suitable land and the lots that are available to construct new buildings is a concern, and we are working on that. What I'd say is that the government is working to try to address this. Even before the fire had began, even before the fire had started, and the issue that we see ourselves before now, we were already in discussions with the municipality of Hay River. Appreciate the work that the Acknowledgments First Nations has stepped up, and the work that we have done with the Acknowledgments First Nations as well. So we are working on it, and it is one of the communities that we want to continue to find a solution for the whether it's public housing or market housing needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, the member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier on, I spoke about the costs of the costs of food in N.W.T, and my questions are for the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, my first question is more of an update. Can the Minister report if the Government of Northwest Territories is working with the federal government to make Nutrition North more successful addressing food security in the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
All right, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance will rise and respond to the members' questions. The N.W.T has met with the federal government on Nutrition North Canada on both the ministerial and official level on numerous occasions. Most recently, officials have been engaged in discussions around work to make the program more efficient and transparent. The N.W.T representative for the Nutrition North Advisory Board on this program is a nutritionist from the Beaufort Delta who is well placed to provide perspective on the needs of Northerners. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nakita Dayakasi, member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to see that the different levels of government are working on this together. Mr. Speaker, my second question is, what strategies are we working on to address food insecurity in Nunavut, and can we regulate healthy food prices the way we do with liquor and cannabis? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's many initiatives across the GNWT that help address food insecurity. A few of these include there's obviously income assistance to those who require it and are eligible, including funds for food. This is part of a variety of programs that help offset cost of living, like public housing and the cost of living credit. Through the Northern Wellness Funding, many communities are delivering school-based meal programs, elders' lunches, Meals on Wheels, hosting collective kitchens for young families, and providing good food boxes for families in need. Nutrition North Canada's Nutrition Education Initiative builds skills and knowledge on healthy eating and making wide food choices from the stores and traditional food sources. Nutrition education is a collaborative effort between elders, CHRs, dietitians, and other community workers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tada Dayakasi, member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister report if the Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk Highway has reduced the prices of food in the community? And also, I'm wondering, since the cost of petroleum products, the cost of transportation has risen in Northwest Territories, I'm wondering if the Department is monitoring the cost of food in remote communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk Highway is a great project, was well received, being up from in the Bodell, at times being on the highway. I see the use that people are the number of people that are on it, the number of people that are going to Inuvik actually to do a lot of their shopping, and I'm sure it's reduced their cost of living because they are picking up things in Inuvik. As far as the overall cost of living in the community itself, I don't have that information at my fingertips. However, I will commit to the member that we'll compile some information and share it with the members. It's important to remember, though, that there are many factors that impact prices in the communities. But I do say that having seen the number of people that are coming in and taking advantage of the ability to leave the community at any time to go shopping in Inuvik, I think it's helped lower the cost of living. But again, I've made a commitment to do some research and get some information back to the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Infrastructure, also responsible for the energy file. It seems like a lot of politicians these days are promising to put their efforts and money into revitalizing the fossil fuel sector. Meanwhile, a news report yesterday indicates that green business is actually outgrowing the rest of the economy, attracting billions of dollars in investment. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister, what steps will the government take to grow a new sustainable sector of the economy by exploiting the growing number of businesses and entrepreneurs bringing green, renewable energy technology to the table? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're already taking significant steps to leverage new federal funding. Everyone in this House knows that, and to support these new initiatives that we're laying out. We're making unprecedented investments to support energy initiatives across the Northwest Territories. This year, we will invest over $60 million in projects and initiatives intended to support secure, reliable, and sustainable energy in the Northwest Territories. And all this investment, we know, will support economic growth, particularly to the businesses and entrepreneurs around this green and renewable energy table. Also, key to all this is in discussions we had in the House today to our long-term economic sustainability in the Northwest Territories is to bring clean and affordable energy to the industry in the Northwest Territories, and that would be the Tulsan Energy Project. But as you see in many of our new projects that we lay out across the Northwest Territories through infrastructure, we steadily increase our solar panels and our biomass. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nakita Council Member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for reminding us of the considerable investment that is going to be being made in the North, and I really truly hope that it does get in the hands of entrepreneurs and small businesses. Mr. Speaker, I've asked this before, and so I'll ask it again. Will the Minister commit the government to study the energy microgrid concept that has been similar to what SSI Energy is proposing in Fort Providence? It seems like it would be a very sound and great solution for small communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, and I'd love to update the House on this particular question. We have met with SSI Micro, and we've actually, our staff have gone to the community of Fort Providence to understand the system that the SSI actually has in place right now and discuss the potential for integration of a microgrid into the technologies into the system. We're interested in learning a lot more about what the SSI has to offer, about their proposal and the potential of their graphite batteries, specifically what they have proposed to use as an energy recovery and dispersal system in their system. And we will continue to work with them and see if this is a situation that SSI is proposing that could be worked in Fort Providence, but maybe in other communities across the system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tadade Council Member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. I really appreciate that his department, his staff are undertaking endeavors to communicate with SSI Energy and the community of Providence, and we look forward to being posted on that in the future. Mr. Speaker, the Minister talked earlier about continuing to invest in wind and solar, and so my question is, what ongoing support can the Minister offer to the number of solar energy companies starting up across the N.W.T? Can the Minister also convince his energy division and particularly cabinet colleagues to increase the net metering allowance from 15 kilowatt an hour to 50 kilowatt an hour like our friends in the Yukon are doing? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Everybody else will. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the member, thank you, Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the member is the government has over $330 million to invest in electricity in electricity infrastructure in the Northwest Territories going forward. That's going to result in more construction jobs, local jobs, and suppliers where it's possible. In addition, the N.W.T is investing over $31 million in the Low Carbon Economy Fund that we announced here earlier this year, which will leverage over $70 million over the next 3 years. This will also support the local builders and contractors and suppliers to do energy retrofits and install renewable energy in the system. 50% rebates are being available through the Arctic Energy Alliance to residents and businesses in thermal zone communities and provide an excellent incentive for new installations and merge in over 25 diesel communities. To the point about raising the net metering, that's going to put a lot of pressure on the system. That is something the Department of Finance and NCPC would have to have a serious look at. It would have serious implications on all residents across the system, and that's something we're going to have to be very careful, because when we went out and talked to the people of the Northwest Territories, they made it very clear to us that we had to have a secure, affordable, and sustainable plan going forward, and this could put more pressure on the system and make it more expensive for everybody. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nodere Council Member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Minister for his reply, and we can certainly leave the solar and net metering discussion for another day. But the N.W.T's reliance on diesel power generation is one of our biggest challenges. We all know that. There's a growing sector of renewable diesel. I'll repeat that, renewable diesel, which can replace fossil fuels without engine modifications and greatly reduce emissions. The City of Vancouver is changing over their entire fleet to renewable diesel. Will the Minister commit the government to research renewable diesel as a possible option for the future? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi, Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to update this House that we are already looking at this. We are investigating this potential of renewable diesel technologies. But one thing I can say is there is one contractor supply in Western Canada, and confirmed it is being deployed in one major city, which is probably the City of Vancouver. but we have concerns over this thing. And when I've talked to the deputy about this specific possibility, we're worried about the life cycle of this stuff and the storage capacity that we have in the communities and how long will it be good for. Pricing, it's way more expensive than the price of diesel fuel right now. So that goes back to the question of what the people of the Northwest Territories told us. They want a secure, affordable, sustainable energy plan going forward with only one supplier in the country and it being more expensive is right now at this point is probably not viable, but we will continue to monitor this thing, and with further hopes and further developments, maybe this can become successful and we'll be able to implement it into our system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canadian, the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question for the Minister of Health and Social Services. In response to the high-rise fire, a public health order was issued to the owner of the high-rise on April 10th. It detailed what needed to be done before it could be assessed whether or not residents could return. The owner was ordered to obtain a qualified environmental professional to prepare a plan for assessment and remediation in order to prevent mold growth due to water damage and to submit a report detailing the remediation work that had been done. Mr. Speaker, no report was provided, and there's no evidence that any remediation work has taken place. And in fact, the situation seems to have worsened significantly. What is the department doing in response to the owner's non-compliance? Does the department have any recourse, or is the order essentially toothless? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on April 10th, the Chief Public Health Officer did make an order for the owner to do an environmental assessment on the building to determine the things that the member has identified. At the time, we were comfortable knowing that there was limited access to the building because the Fire Marshal and the Worker Safety Compensation Commission also had some orders, so they were in care and control of the building, which would limit access. Mr. Speaker, on May 14th, when the orders from the WSCC and the Fire Marshal were concluded, we had an opportunity to get into the building and see that things have in fact worsened. So we have actually issued another order, and the order is a little bit more significant this time. We're actually asking that a qualified environmental company be identified and taken into the building to determine the level of exposure in the building. As the member has said, things have worsened since the fire. The building did get significantly wet inside. There's mold growing. There's more problems. Mr. Speaker, we never got a report on the initial assessment we asked for. We're hopeful that we will get something from the owner of the building before they can actually move forward and do anything on that building, any rehabilitation, any changes. They will have to meet that order, and they will also have to meet any additional requirements put on them by the WSCC and the Fire Marshal. So we will be monitoring. The order is not toothless, Mr. Speaker. We do have the ability to fine the individual should the order not be met. We also have the ability to require some work to be done, which we can bill back to the owner. We haven't reached that point. We have just gotten access to that building on May 14th and have issued the order since then. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'll see. Oral question, Nakeda Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You can't get blood from a stone, so I'm not sure that fining the owner or doing work and then billing it back is going to do anything here. I'm not sure if there's the money there to do any of this work. It certainly doesn't seem that way. So what is the department willing to do on its own if the owner doesn't do any remediation work? At what point does this become a public health issue that the department has to deal with? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the department isn't blind, and we can also read. We've seen the information on Facebook and other social media that the owner of the building is likely not going to do this work. Mr. Speaker, we're prepared to work closely with the WSCC. We're prepared to work closely with the Fire Marshal. We haven't moved forward with a fine because of the exact reason the member has indicated. The likelihood of getting money out of that is unlikely, and the bottom line is we're more interested in remediation of the building and health protection than we are in getting money from the owner. So, Mr. Speaker, we are exploring our options. They haven't all been determined. I will certainly, absolutely, without question, share any information with the member when it becomes evident or when we actually have some concrete actions in line. But at this point, we're working closely with our other partners to see what is done, to see what pressure can be put on the owner. If the owner does come forward with a rehabilitation plan, it will have to meet the conditions outlined in the WSCC, the fire marshal, and it will have to address the hazmat and the contamination issues that are identified within our order. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What is the deadline for compliance with this new order? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, the issue was ordered on May 17th. I will confirm with the department what the deadline on that order is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Member Hay River North.
Thank you. And the minister spoke of some of the challenges that they're facing, but is there a plan that, does the department have a plan in place if this order is not complied with? Is there something concrete that he can share with us right now? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Health and Social Services is concerned about the public health of the residents of Hay River and the contamination in the building. We have limited access to the building. There is no access to the building unless somebody is properly gowned, prepared to go into that building, recognizing the hazmat and the contamination issues. We don't have a plan to do anything with the building other than keep it under lock and key until such time as our conditions are met. But we recognize that work needs to be done. Owners, community, and other organizations like the WSCC and the Fire Marshal's Office to attempt to find some resolution moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Time for oral questions has expired. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Committee on Revealed Bills. Reports of Committee on Revealed Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Report of Special Warrants issued March 15th to May 22nd, 2019. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Tabling of documents. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Follow-up Letter to Oral Question 693-18, bracket 3, positive feedback for Health and Social Services. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Tabling of documents. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table a letter dated May 21st, 2019 from the Mayor of Fort Simpson addressed to me regarding Nutrition North and a bridge issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion, first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Bill 26, Bill 30. Committee Report 15, 18.3. Minister's Statement 151, 18.3. Minister's Statement 158, 18.3. With Member Hay River North in the chair.
I will call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the chair rise and report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. There's a motion to report progress. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Bill 26, Bill 30, Committee Report 15-18 brackets 3, Minister Statement 151-18 brackets 3, and Minister Statement 158-18 brackets 3, and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Massey. Do I have a seconder? Member for Trinidad Holiday. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Madam Clerk, orders of the day.
Mr. Speaker, there will be a public meeting of the Special Committee on Transition Matters in Committee Room A at 12:30 p.m. today. Indaidze edani legedi ha weketi. Edaidzek e tundo za nano datson eketai. Nakelemi huno datson hunto honte. Hayat eti kaode hayati eketet sodon hayati. Indi kaode dawets ike inle gotson nagode. Haton goga gekwe giji hats edi. Asi wekedzon ats ehi. Kaode da ets eke. Nitle da ets eke. Indi nitle ha da ets ike ile gotson nagogede. Commissioner Weatik e hayats eti goizit asit eke. Standing aids on committee, special committees on amigo di wets on nawode wegon ginda wegodi donne ala nitle gigara ha negele. Nawon wek edzon ra yati nita aquehlo nawon nitle wek edzon ra hats edi nawon hotle aquehlo nawon nitle wek eti nanke ton nawon nitle wek eti nawon ala wegon legeti ra ho nawon nitle dino datson ek edi nawon nitle tano wigodi huno datson silai awode hayati I leaqueno datson silano datson isle awode hayati I leaqueno datson sileno ek edi edani legedi wegon hagedi tight on nawon nitle wek eti indaidze edani legedi ha wek eti.
Good job. Tadid zenke sets dia na hot in the sets dia de Monday, May 27 isla thani ke on de wish who we on the